This is a psalm that really kind of echoes. It's a different situation altogether than Psalm 73. In Psalm 73, you notice it says the Asaph wrote this. Well, we have a big question about Asaph because obviously this Asaph would come along several hundred years after the first Asaph because the first Asaph was in David's court, whereas obviously we see that this was an Asaph who um, lived during the destruction of the temple and the exile, the final exile that when Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the nation, slaughtered the kings of the king, and took Daniel. Now there was three different deportations. There was Daniel and his friends on the first deportation, probably Ezekiel on the second, and then on the third, I don't know if Asaph had seen this and then had been exiled, as if he's writing this from memory from exile or what. But notice it says the sons of Asaph were descendants of the choir director Asaph, Asaph one, I guess we can call him, who lived during David's reign. The Asaph obviously lived during the destruction of the temple and the exile of the people to Babylon. Whereas Asaph in Psalm 73 is vexed by the prospering of the wicked and the suffering of the righteous, this Asaph in Psalm 74 is devastated by the utter destruction of everything he held dear. Now, don't forget these musicians, they grew up around that temple court. They had their rounds and so forth, but that was their ministry. That they grew up, their families grew up singing. They learned how, and they were, his daddy, his great granddaddy, his great great granddaddy probably was all part of the the temple court that these Levites who led the singing during the feast and the Passover and so forth. And so that's all he ever knew. Now, of course, he lived probably in or around Jerusalem. And so that means that whenever he saw the temple utterly destroyed, now that temple was beautiful. I mean, it had gold inlaid and then all the tapestries, even more so than what we read about the ones in the tabernacle in the wilderness and all that woven linen and so forth. Um, and so we see that the temple was his life. And now everything was gone. It's probably, even if he lived around there, he probably even had his Levitical quarters around there somewhere. I mean, is where he lived. Um, he says the prophet Jeremiah echoes the same sentiments. Now, Jeremiah is known as what? The weeping prophet. Now, he has been warning all of his life, and he's been thrown in jail and so forth. Um, and in the book of Lamentation, he goes through the city of Jerusalem and just sees how all the utter devastation, and he laments over the people rejecting. Most of these prophets, we think of them. Isaiah, fantastic prophet, lived 200 or 300 years before, or at least a couple hundred years before Jeremiah. But we look at these guys, and we we think of how great the preachers they were. Well, in their day, they probably would have been considered failures. They were rejected. Remember Isaiah, after he saw the Lord high and lifted up, the Lord said, "I'm going to send you to people. They're going to hear, but they will not. They will not hear. They're going to see, and they refuse to see." And so, and we call his great messages that he preached. We call it the gospel according to Isaiah, because he presents salvation so well, so many times, and the people, as he says, are willfully ignorant. And so, how sad that was. But he says, and although the prophets had been predicting God's judgment upon Israel, and if we could even go back to 2 Chronicles chapter 36, the reality of such an event was unthinkable. Now think about this. How many times have we heard, even we've heard in the news media, that our present course in our country is unsustainable? That's one of the words that we hear in mainstream media. We are unsustainable in what we're doing today, whether it's economy or whatever else. Then you think about just the utter degradation that's coming from the top. I mean, we've got people that are absolutely depraved, that are in the head echelons of our country and are being promoted by the most powerful people in our country. Education system is totally corrupt. Who would have ever thought that we would have mutilation being taught and then hidden from the parents in schools? And then we have, the teachers saying we know better for the kids, and that the institution of marriage. And that's the one thing that I remember all the way back until right after I graduated from high school. Now for the last 50 years, I remember sitting in Valencia Junior College classes, and we'd have these discussions, and they kept talking about the institutions. Well, to me, the institutions when I was 17, 18, 19 years old were, big building. You think of columns and all. No, they were talking about, and these liberal teachers were talking about we've got to destroy the underpinnings of society. Back then, they were talking about burning down buildings and sit-ins and make war, not peace, and or make peace, not war, and all that kind of stuff. You had the Vietnam War going on, and all the hippies and all that. And so, but that was just. I remember when when there was another presidential election, and there were liberals running, and Michael Dukakis was running, and his campaign secretary, or the head of his campaign, she believed that one of the great evils of society in America was private ownership. Well, if we don't have private ownership, we don't have freedom. And back then, he got 40% of the vote. This time, he'd get about 49.9, and you're always playing around. The next time around, it's going to be 50, like we're already seeing. And so we see that we're just about past the tipping point. We probably already are past the tipping point. And we hear about the unsustainable. Then you hear if God doesn't judge America, then he's going to have to apologize to Sodom and Gomorrah. Well, what will that look like? I mean, you go to your car lot that you work in and you're praying that God will help, and it's destroyed. I mean, you turn on your gas oven, if you got one, and there's no gas. Then you go home and it's burnt. Your house is burned. And your whole town is totally destroyed. And your government, I mean, you can't go anywhere because, there's been cyber attacks or whatever. What is that going to look like? Or what if the communists take over or whatever, and this is something that was just totally, now Asaph grew up around all this, and he had heard, that, God's going to judge Israel. But when he saw it, he was totally unprepared for it. Just like you and I would be. I have no idea what that means. We've got a little taste of it every once in a while. But what will it mean where there's no going back, where you realize, hey, we're not going to recover from this? I mean, we've been, one of our cities has been destroyed. Now we're thinking about, we don't have, we just get into the military and all the rest. I mean, we could suffer some tremendous military defeats now. We think we're the strongest country in the world. Well, it doesn't take but to wipe out a couple of those aircraft carriers out there in the Pacific, and you've wiped out about 15,000 people. And I mean, just things like that. Would that cause psychological harm in our country? It causes a lot of problems with it. It'd be a lot worse than Pearl Harbor. And so we see that we have no idea what can happen. But God, so here Asaph is, he had heard all this all his life. He had heard Jeremiah preach. He had heard other people preaching. And he knew what the prophets had said. And, growing up, I'd heard all this all my life. And all of a sudden you go there and there's that temple, that beloved temple, and it's totally destroyed. What would you do? I mean, you can imagine how he felt. So I said it was beyond the scope of Asaph's imagination, and it shook his faith to the core. Now, in Psalm 73, verse 17, we see that the first Asaph that we read about went to the temple to find solace and comfort. Remember, he said last week, we see in verse 17, he was vexed, he said. But he said, until I went into the sanctuary of God, then I understood their end. And where the righteous are suffering and the wicked are prospering. But he said, I got went into the house of God and I contemplated, but yeah, this is where God's presence. And as long as we keep our eyes on God, this too shall pass. And in the end, God's going to win. Now that's great coming from that perspective. But now there's no temple to go back to. There's nothing. I mean, the whole city has been burned with fire. In fact, later on, a couple of decades later, Nehemiah gets reports back to Persia, and he says the whole city just still looks like a dump. And he cried, and he was sad when he went before the king, and then he was afraid because you're not, as a cupbearer, you're not supposed to be afraid. I mean, you're not supposed to be sad, especially if you're tasting the king's food. But so we see that. So Asaph was comforted, the first Asaph, but now the second Asaph he's got a lot worse things than just a bunch of people that he doesn't like that are prospering. But he says, now the glory of the Lord, and that's the great study we've done before. In the book of Ezekiel, you go to chapter 9, verse 3, 10:4, 10:18, 10:19, and you see how that the presence of God, the glory of God left that temple. And how that God now was turning, and really during this time, Israel was now never going to have another king until the Messiah came. And of course, they won't have an earthly king until the Messiah comes again. But the line of David, as far as humanly speaking, has now ended. And we see the age of the Gentiles that was outlined by Daniel in chapter 3 of Daniel has taken over. And so we're in the age of the Gentiles now. But we see that so the temple, the glory of the Lord had departed, and now Israel has been judged. And Israel's king has been slaughtered. Remember Zedekiah, he went up against Nebuchadnezzar, and Nebuchadnezzar killed all of his kids and then killed him. Put it out his eyes and so forth. And so in Psalm 74, the psalmist realizes that God did not need the temple made with hands. Now this is his ultimate. Okay, Lord, everything that I hold here dear is gone, near and dear. But you're still on the throne. And this is where, notice now, until I went into the house of the Lord. Now here you have, in verse 12, the change. Now, in verse 17, the first Asaph said, I'm going to trust God no matter what. Now, remember the king is no more. His eyes have been put out, his kids have been destroyed, killed, and all the rest. But he says, for God is my king. So notice he goes back, I don't need a king, and I don't need the temple. God, and that really is brought out by Stephen in Acts chapter 7, verses 44 through 50, as these Pharisees and all these rulers are still wanting to kick the Christians out of the temple, and Stephen says, God doesn't live in a temple made with hands. And of course, he lives in the universe, and of course, he decided, and his goal with Israel was that he dwelt there in Zion. He wanted to be among the people, of course, in the tabernacle and so forth. But when they left him, he left them. And so we see in verse 12, he proclaims, God is king. In doing so, his faith now has to rise above the ashes. It rises above the circumstances. What will it take for us, or what would happen to us, if we have nothing but God, where we have no idea what's going to happen next? I mean, if the trucks come in and start hauling us away, or what can they do to persecute us? Start throwing us in jail. All of a sudden, we wake up and find out that we've been totally taken over by Red China, which they pretty well have taken over our communications. But what are we going to do when they burn the churches? Now, the bad thing about it, the church is already empty. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? There's parallels, although you don't read present day back into Israel, but the temple was already desecrated, and the churches that are around today, a lot of those mega churches are promoting the very things that God hates. And so, yes, there's always the remnant, like there was with Asaph here and Jeremiah and several others, and even in Elijah's day. Remember, he said there's at least 7,000 out of how many? How many million? 7,000 is not a very high number. And so we see that there's always that remnant. But are you the remnant? Are we going to be the remnant that says, it doesn't matter what happens, I'm going to trust God? Now notice the progression here as we look at the psalm. First of all, he says, "Oh God, why have you cast us off forever? Why does your anger smoke against the sheep of your pasture? Remember your congregation, which you have purchased of old, the tribe of your inheritance, which you have redeemed, the Mount Zion, where you have dwelt. Lift up your feet to perpetual desolations. The enemy has damaged everything in the sanctuary." So notice he is feeling, first of all, the feeling of rejection. Lord, where you've cast us off. Now, it was one thing to say, yeah, we deserve judgment. But now all of a sudden judgment's coming. All of a sudden, why has God done this to us? So that's very what we do too. Well, we deserve judgment. And then if God really gives us a double whammy, and even if we mention that maybe God is judging us, God's a loving God. We don't want to. Lord, you wouldn't be doing that to us, would you? And so here we have, why have you cast us off? Lord, we're your sheep. Notice the terms that he uses. He says, you've cast us off forever. The sheep of your pasture. Psalm 100. We are the sheep of your pasture. Remember your congregation, your people, who you purchased, you redeemed of old. The tribe of your inheritance, you've promised us things. Mount Zion, you said we've sung that song, is Mount Zion on the sides of the north, the city of the great king. And all this, Lord, lift up, and your enemy has damaged everything, destroyed everything in the sanctuary. Notice why, Lord, why have you done it? Now, there again, he had heard the preaching all his life that God's going to do something, but now it's happened. Lord, rejection. Rejection is one of the strongest negative feelings that a person could have. That's one of the things that people, especially when loved ones reject you or whatever else, it's so difficult. But when you feel like God's rejected you, I wonder, is Asaph's family dead now? Does he know where they are? Have they been carted off to Babylon already? I mean, is he alone? Is he one of those people like in the Holocaust who doesn't have any family around? Is he a young man? Is he older? We don't know. But he's penning this. He said, Lord, Lord, we were expecting a spanking, but not a beating. We were expecting, some firecrackers, but not atom bombs. And so, Lord, why are you doing this? And so then we see not only a feeling of rejection, but a feeling of shock. He starts looking around. Your enemies roar in the midst of your meeting. They set up their banners for signs. So they marched in with their banners, and they've taken over. They seemed like those who lift up axes among the thick tree. They've taken battering rams and axes, and he says hammers in verse 6. I mean, they've just destroyed all this delicate work of art, all these things that we put so much time into, and they just came in like a bunch of raging animals and ripped things apart, like a lot of vandals. Now, one of the reasons he did, because those building, like later on in Herod's temple, it was inlaid with gold. And so notice he even talks about fire, because they'd set fire inside the temple with all those curtains and everything. And when the gold melted, they were ready to scrape it off. And that's one of the ways that armies of old looted, and they were able to get a lot of pay from the things they looted. And so, Lord, all this beautiful work that we've seen, and we've been the glory of the nations. People would come and look at this. We were a tourist attraction, and now it's gone. And they just came in and they've torn it apart. And so he's saying they burned the meeting places. And there again, now the word meeting place is the word synagogue. So I think in the King James, there's a phrase in there where it says synagogue. Well, there's like a deacon, there's a servant, which diakonos means, and then there's the office of a servant. Well, the office of the synagogue, or the synagogue, which took the place of the temple, originated during the Babylonian captivity. So it had been a few years off from here. But the meeting places, Lord, they've destroyed everything. We can't congregate anywhere. We have been so blessed. If we had 400 people out at the revival meetings the other week. You realize what that would mean in China? That'd be a huge group. Well, how about Iran? Would you like to try to be a part of that in Iran? You're not going to get that many people. China, we're talking about house churches in China, and they're hauling them off, even from a little house church. And so, everything is gone. We can't even meet in large numbers. And so it just is utterly devastating to him. So he says it's just a total shock to his whole system. And then, worst of all, he feels abandoned. Notice in verse 9, he says, we do not see our signs. In other words, we've seen prophets, we've seen you work. We remember what Hezekiah did a few decades ago, and how that God delivered, and how that the prophets have come and preached to us. And there's no longer a prophet. Where's Jeremiah? He's out there, roaming around, lamenting himself, but he didn't have a crowd. And so these two didn't get in contact with one another. So all these people are wandering around. He says, "Nor is there any among us who knows how long." There's nobody who could tell us what's going to happen next. Now, we've had prophets that have done that before, even though they've said some pretty mean things. But now there's nobody. Where's the direction? Of course, they're all off in Babylon. You had Ezekiel and Daniel and several others that are the leaders are gone. All the nobility is gone. So what are we going to do? He says, "Oh Lord, how long?" Notice how long. "Oh Lord, how long will the adversary reproach? Will the enemies blaspheme your name forever? Are you going to, Lord, these people are mean." Remember what Habakkuk said, "Lord, how can you let this go on in Israel? We are so evil." And then the Lord said, "Well, don't worry, Habakkuk. I'm going to raise up the Babylonians, and they're going to take care of you." And then Habakkuk said, "Wait a minute, Lord. These people are mean. They're godless." And here it is, the fulfillment of Habakkuk's prophecies. And so even Habakkuk, boy, how can this happen? And there again, how can it happen to America? How can it happen to our country? And yet we see that it can. I hope it doesn't, but there again, we don't deserve anything from the way we're rejecting God. And so we see that he says, "Will the enemy blaspheme your name forever? Why do you withdraw your hand?" That right hand of God is the protecting hand, when he puts his hand upon you or whatever. "Take it out of your bosom and destroy him." And so, Lord, I'm destined. What do I do? You've rejected us. It's just unreal what we're seeing. And now I feel like you've totally abandoned us. And what do I do? I don't even know where I'm going to get fed tomorrow. I don't even know where my house is. I don't even have a house. I might be able to scrape together some old bricks or something from the walls or something and live under them if he's there. Now he might be being carted off to Babylon at this time. Who knows? But now we see in verse 12, here's the big change, just like in verse 17 of Psalm 73. But now he gets hold of himself. But he says, but God is my king. Now he let himself get into a pity party for a moment, but he caught himself. God's still on the throne. I don't know, I mean, it looks totally destitute, but I know God lives. And no matter how bad it gets, there's a God in heaven. I love that Daniel, defenseless teenager, stands before the most powerful and one of the most cruel men that's ever walked the face of the earth, Nebuchadnezzar. I love what he said. "O king, there's a God in heaven." Now, wait a minute. You're wanting to be God, but no, there's a God in heaven. Now, that took a lot of bravery for a young man to do that. But there's a God in heaven. And so here we see there's a God in heaven. Wait a minute. The communists have come in, or the Russians have come in, or the Chinese, whatever, you name it. The liberals, whatever's come in and destroyed it. Wait a minute. There's still a God in heaven. I wonder what it was like in Nazi Germany in the 30s when there were Christians there and they saw their country taken over and they were totally helpless to do anything about it. Well, sometimes I feel like that with our elections now, totally helpless. I'm seeing every week almost, I'm hearing of some denomination or some church that is going off the deep end spiritually into all this perversion in our land, and they're promoting it within the churches. How can God, and I feel so alone as a pastor, and then trying to get a group of people together, they're very fractious because they got all their own little pet peeves or whatever. How do you build a church these days? And you can say, well, I'm just going to give up. No, there's a God in heaven. And God says his church is going to go on until he comes back for it. So I got to keep my head above the water and above the ashes. Now, God can destroy everything, but there's a God in heaven. And he's got a purpose for us here. And so we see that he rises above the circumstances. Now notice what he does. He goes back and remembers what God has done. And so we see that he says, you have divided, he says, first of all, working salvation in the midst of the earth. So Lord, you're still the Savior. You're still the one who meets the needs of the people. You divided the sea by your strength. Now, of course, that's poetically. Now, when did he divide the sea? That was such a major, ingrained truth to every generation of Old Testament Jew. God delivered us from Pharaoh through the crossing of the sea. It's the greatest miracle in all the Old Testament. It was a picture of redemption and so forth. So he says, he divided the sea by your strength. You broke the heads of the sea serpents in the water. Now, what in the world is he talking about there? Well, basically, if you look at, remember the water and the different, this is poetically talking about the gods of Egypt. And again, he talks about the Leviathan, which many people believe, okay, that's probably the crocodile. Have you ever been in a river where you think there's an alligator or crocodile? That's the most eerie feeling. One time I was out on the Mobile River, and I went out with a guy who just wanted to test his boat out, but he also knew I could ski, so I decided I'd ski with him. And he opened that thing up, and man, I've never skied so fast. My lips were, going, and my ears were pinned back to and then he turned around, and I was thinking, man, this guy's crazy. But he slung me, if you've ever, I was just holding on with all my dear life but then I lost it, and I hit the water 3 times before I went under. Before I finally came to my senses. But then all of a sudden I remembered, I've just been reading about alligators in this river, and how that they just bit somebody the other day. And here I am out in the middle of this river, and he's got to turn around and come back for me. And that is an eerie feeling. That when you can't see him, And every time you see a little bit of, what was that, is that an alligator's eye? You know, I mean, paranoid. But there again, this is that creepy feeling. And of course, when you have all those gods of Egypt, and you got Lord of the Flies, and you got then you got Pharaoh and his strength and everything. So this would be a picture of not only the political force that those people felt, but also just the evils of the gods of Egypt. And I mean, it was a demon-possessed place. And so we see that the heads of you broke those. Now, whenever God breaks a head, that means He's destroying the power. Remember what He does? You know, the serpent, you're going to bruise the Lord's heel, but He's going to bruise your head. The idea is He's going to. I mean, yeah, you're going to get him in the foot, but He's going to get you in the head, and so He's going to take away your power. But He broke the heads of Levi, and he gave him as food to the people inhabiting the wilderness. Notice, you broke open the fountain and the flood. Now, what is he talking about there? When did He break open the fountain and the flood? 2 different times. Remember the water the water from the rock? And then, of course, you dried up the mighty rivers. Well, the mighty river, what mighty river did He dry up so that people could cross? So these were all things that were ingrained in his head about what God had done 400 years before when Israel came into the land of promise. So they knew their history. And that is so vital for us. That's the reason we have people trying to destroy the very underpinnings of our society, because kids don't know anything about this today. George Washington was mean, whatever. Abraham Lincoln loved, just all kinds of crazy stuff that kids are hearing today. And they have no heroes. No, nobody that literally look back on the back, or they don't see any gods. They don't see God's shed His grace on thee. They don't see it. All they hear about is all the bad things that we've ever done. And what country has not done bad things? And so there again, in verse 16, notice he says, not only do remember what you did, but also, Lord, you're in control of everything. The day is yours. The night also is yours. You have prepared the light and the sun. I mean, basic creation. Notice how he's going back to basic creation. Lord, you control it all. He says, you have set all the borders of the earth. You have made summer and winter. I mean, you control, and you made day and night. You made the stars of heaven. You made the sun and light. And you made summer and winter. Boy, I wish He had not made winter the way He did up here in Illinois, but He made summer and winter. But God, I think God has a sense of humor when He sends us people live in Illinois, but in January or December, January. But there again, He made it all. And so what are we to do? That's the reason I love that song, and I started singing it when the sun starts coming up now. When morning gilds the sky, may Jesus Christ be praised. Well, man, alive, the sun doesn't come up till 10 o'clock, well, almost, in the morning now. But may Jesus, and I have to fight it. I have to admit, I have to fight feeling down during these days. But may Jesus Christ be praised. And so, again, notice he goes back to the things he knows and to the very basics of creation. And by the way, one of the things that you will see, the only time in the Bible that you see angels directly preaching the gospel is in the book of Revelation. And you know what they say? Remember the Creator. They go back to creation. And creation is, if you do away with direct creation of man by the direct act of God, then you've pretty well talking about pulling the foundations out from the rest of Scripture. Because you're going to have a hard time with Romans chapter 5 with salvation when the Lord says, for as by one man sin entered into the world. Who was that man? Adam? Well, when did Adam come? So by one man sin into and death by sin. Well, when did death come? It came after sin, so that means there could not have been any evolution because nothing died until man sinned. And then you go into the first Adam and the second Adam, of course, talking about Adam being the one who, as a result of him, we all die. And the second Adam, Jesus Christ, who was created and became man, the perfect man, well, we all live. Now, if there's not a first Adam, or if there was, and he evolved, at what time did he evolve? You're getting at all kinds of questions there if there was not a direct act of God in making man and in creation. And so there again, it's one of those underpinnings of society, of Bible. And without the creation, everything else falls apart. Even salvation. How can you trust salvation if he says that in him all things exist? And he made all things, and in him all. Is that true or is it not? Is he the creator, sustainer? If he's not, then the world is not really in his control. Well, let's don't go too deep in that. Okay, so any more deep than we have anyway, deeply. So he says, these are the things I know. Lord, you made me. You created me for this time. We can go back to Psalm 31. Lord, my times are in your hands. Everything about me is up to you. And so these are the things I know. But then, Lord, there are things that I know you can do. And that's the rest of the chapter, or the rest of the book, Psalm. So notice he says, starting in verse 18, he says, the voice, excuse me, I skipped over it. Okay, here it is. He says, remember. Now, the idea of remember here is not that, Lord, you can forget, but it's like somebody does you something, I tell my wife every once in a while, whenever I've done a lot for her, and I'll say, you owe me. It's one of those things like, remember, and she'll come back with me, you owe me. So it's back and forth, But the idea is you can do this. And I know you remember it, so seek him, Lord. So remember this, that the enemy has reproached you, O Lord. So, Lord, it's impossible. And your righteousness demands judgment, so you've got to do something to him. And so, secondly, he says, oh, that foolish people have blasphemed your name. Lord, you're going to let them do that? Yeah, it's great to be able to talk to God like that. Lord, you can take care of them better than I can. Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. Verse 19, he says, oh, do not deliver the life of your turtle dove to the wild beast. The turtle dove was the poorest of the sacrificial offerings. And now he's saying your people are down there as the poorest of the poor. And don't deliver these to the beast. Do not forget the life of your poor forever. There's that word forever again. Lord, you can't cast us off forever, so something's got to happen because you can't do this. I know that in the back of my mind, but I've got to get it in the front of my mind that you are not going to let this go on forever because, as we're going to see, you have respect for your covenant, and there it is. We are your covenant people, Lord, and you have promised us the promised land. You have promised us the Messiah is going to come through us. You've got to remember this. Have respect to your covenant. Now, he's not preaching to God. He's just, he's reminding himself of what God has said. And he's not accusing God of calling him a liar or anything, but Lord, have respect to your covenant and help me to see that respect, basically. He says, for the dark places of the earth are full of haunts of cruelty. And Lord, I can't imagine the things I have seen. Can you imagine what it must have been like with people hacked up and destroyed and buildings burnt with the people in them? And war is a nasty thing. I mean, just think about some of the things going on over in Ukraine. I mean, those people have seen things I hope I never see. But they have seen utter destruction, and you can imagine there's bodies laying all around. Uh, just horrible stuff. Verse 21. Oh, do not let the oppressed return ashamed. Lord, cheer us up. We, you know, um, we're down. Let the needy praise your name, Lord. We're down, but help us, Lord. We got to find a way to praise you. We just got to praise you, Lord. But help us. But he says, arise, O God, plead your own cause. No, Lord, this is your cause. You've already said it's your cause. You said that you're the righteous one, and these people are evil. So you got to plead your own. Lord, this is your battle. Remember how the foolish man reproaches you daily. They say all kinds of mean things about you. Do not forget the voice of your enemies. The tumult of all those who raise up against you increases continually. Notice that's where he stops. But what is he doing? He's casting all of this on God and says, Lord, this is your problem. And sometimes we have to do that. You know, Lord, this is your church. Lord, you know I've done everything in this family situation that I can do, and I've tried my best to be a good testimony, but all I can do is all I can do, Lord, and the rest is yours. You know, and that's why I used to tell, and I tried to coach that way when I was coaching 7th and 8th grade basketball. And we played some teams, and we had a winning record, but there were a couple of teams, there was no way we were going to beat them. They were just too big of a school and too many gifted athletes. But I said, listen, the only thing that I ask is that we